Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about ADUs, all things ADU. I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Anna Alexeyeva, and I'm the director of the ADU Resource Center of San Mateo County. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the ADU Resource Center in a little bit, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Jennifer Duffy, who is the president of Hello Housing, a fellow nonprofit that focuses on housing related topics. We'll tell you more about our respective organizations in a little bit. Today, we have an informational webinar prepared for you about the nuts and bolts of building an ADU from planning through construction and potentially lease up. Before we get started, though, I want to say a few housekeeping items. First of all, we do have Q&A enabled for this webinar, so if you do have a question, feel free to pop it into the Q&A dialog box, and we'll try to go through as many questions as we can at the end of our presentation. We are recording this webinar, so if you miss any information, don't worry about it. We will circulate a recording of this with all folks who join the webinar afterwards, and you'll also be able to find a recording on the ADU Resource Center's website. And finally, if you'd like the session translated into another language, you can press the CC button that you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen and choose what caption language you'd like to get translation in. So with that, our agenda for today, like I said, is pretty wide-ranging. It's going to go from the conceptualization stage of starting to think about and plan your ADU through the actual construction process. So we are going to be covering a lot of ground. We're going to focus on some of the important things that we think you should know about when you're at the front end of your project, so you can set your project up for success, so you can avoid costly mistakes, and so you can know that you're on track as you get into construction and end up with hopefully a result that you're very happy about in your ADU. I want to just tell you a little bit about the ADU Resource Center. We are a nonprofit. We focus on the peninsula. We work with homeowners, residents, and jurisdictions across San Mateo County to support them on all things ADU. Our goal and our mission is to get more housing units built by serving as a kind of one-stop ADU shop. We have a website, smcadu.org, where you can find lots of resources related to ADUs and that are specific for Peninsula residents, but also helpful information for all folks in California who might be considering building an ADU or in the process. Some of the resources you'll find there are a detailed ADU guidebook that includes step-by-step discussion of the different phases of the process, information about the ADU rules in the different cities in San Mateo County specifically, inspirational ideas like floor plans, stories of neighbors who have built ADUs, and an ADU calculator where you can put in some information about your prospective project and get an estimate for how much you might expect the project to cost. So we have that plus a ton of other information. We also upload all of the webinars that we do, like this one. Sometimes we do webinars that are focused on specific parts of the ADU process. All of that you can find on our website. The webinars are on the events tab of our website. With that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Jennifer, who's going to talk a little bit about Hello ADU and Hello Housing, and then we'll get into the meat of today's presentation.
Great. Thank you, Anna. So as Anna mentioned, I'm Jennifer Duffy. I'm the president of Hello Housing, and we are a nonprofit housing organization that's been working in the Bay Area for about 21 years now, always working in close relationship with government partners, trying to innovate new and creative ways to create more affordable communities for all of us. And in, I would say about 2016, 2017, we launched a program called Hello ADU. And we started this work by supporting a number of jurisdictions across the Bay Area with designing ADU programs that would help provide support, education, and technical assistance to homeowners who are thinking about building an ADU, but somewhat overwhelmed about what the process might look like. And essentially, we provide a variety of different services through Hello ADU. One such service is project management support. So if you are thinking about building an ADU, We help you kind of through each phase of the process. So it might start out with initial feasibility. What can you build on your property? And we do that at your site. We help you evaluate what the conditions might be that will best support the different type of ADU you might be thinking about building. We help you gather your professional team, being able to work with a broad network of different professionals that we've vetted over many years, who are both design professionals, architects, designers, general contractors, surveyors, engineers, and we just help you build that team around your project. We also support homeowners in permit management, being available to support the permitting process all the way through. And then we can also help homeowners who are interested in having support during the construction process and managing the construction activities that take place at the site. So that's one suite of services that we provide. We do this for free for a number of jurisdictions that have particular programs that sponsor us to provide that for homeowners. We also do that on a fee-for-service basis for homeowners who live in jurisdictions where our programs are not being offered. And then finally, recently, we just launched a new program, and that allows different homeowners, should they desire, to hire us to be a design builder, where we will work with homeowners on detached accessory dwelling units, design their ADU, and then build based on that design, the ADU for the homeowner. So that's kind of a suite of services that we've been working on for a number of years throughout different Bay Area jurisdictions, and a little bit about our Hello ADU program. Next slide. So there are so many benefits for building an ADU, and it's really, as an affordable housing organization, it's one of the reasons that we love ADUs. They meet so many different areas across our communities that really represent an important ecosystem in housing. Just looking at some of the benefits, the mechanism to be able to support multi-generational living is a wonderful way by which ADUs have been utilized across the state. Being able to support housing for community members that are affordable naturally. Being able to create rental income and be able to earn money that may be really needed to help your family stay stable as a homeowner and stay stable with rising costs that are abundantly around us. ADUs also have a benefit of increasing your property value when you are creating additional livable square feet as well as potential income producing property that has an impact on your overall property value. There are also just incredible environmental benefits to building ADUs. They work with the existing infrastructure that's already in place at your home, already in place in our communities, therefore not taxing further resources that have to go into creating housing that can sometimes affect our environment in negative ways. And then finally, definitely an area that is near and dear to my heart is being able to create an opportunity for homeowners to age in place, whether that's creating an ADU for a caretaker to be able to provide support, or whether it may mean moving into a smaller, more accessible living environment and renting out the main home to help support your overall costs as you age. So those are just some of the benefits that I think are really important to highlight. There are many more, and we see the new ones every day. With all of that, it is not surprising to know that ADUs are absolutely growing in popularity. When you're looking at this chart, you can see that since ADU laws started to change, especially between the years of 2020 and 2021, there's been a massive increase that has started to take place across the state of California. And just to highlight some of the key indicators, 48% of total new housing units across San Mateo County are ADUs. 1 in 5 new homes in California are ADUs. And there's been 30,000 ADUs that have been permanent in California in 2024. So it's a really significant way by which our communities are creating stealth density, creating more housing, housing that works for a variety of different reasons and for a variety of different purposes.
Okay, that's over to me.
Yeah.
So now we're going to get a little bit into the actual tactics as you might be embarking on your ADU journey. First, I want to talk you through one of the first decisions that you're going to have to make, which is what kind of ADU you want to build. So you have a few different options that you're going to have to consider, and I'm going to talk through the different types of ADUs that are out there. First are junior ADUs, called often JADUs. This is often going to be your cheapest option because they tend to be on the smaller side. A JADU can only be up to 500 square feet. And junior ADUs are conversions of existing living space or attached garages. If you want to convert a detached garage, that wouldn't qualify as a JDU. Now, JDUs actually don't need to have their own separate bathrooms. They can be permitted without their own separate bathrooms as long as there is an interior connection to the primary living space, the primary house. But they do have to have an efficiency kitchen. Um, the next type of ADU is a conversion ADU, an interior conversion. So one way to think about the relationship between JDUs and conversion ADUs is that all JDUs are conversions, but not all conversions are JDUs. So when we're talking about an interior conversion, it can look like the conversion of attic space, detached garage, a basement. Um, these do tend to be cheaper than additions, which I'm going to talk about next, or detached ADUs, but a lot of this comes down to the characteristics of your property and what specifically you're building. One note about these types of ADUs, in addition to junior ADUs, is they don't require solar panels. So in that way, you can save on some of the project costs. Next, we have attached ADUs. These are attached to the primary house. They can be attached through a connected wall. They can be built above a garage, or they can be attached by something like a breezeway or a pergola. Um, the thing about attached ADUs, again, they don't need solar, so they do tend to come in somewhat cheaper than detached ADUs. But of course, because they're attached to your property, there are some limitations on how they can be configured. And finally, we have the classic backyard unit. These are often the most expensive, but they do often provide you with the most flexibility depending on the size and configuration of your lot. They do require new solar panels to be installed, but there are some exceptions to that. As a general rule of thumb, if your ADU is on the smaller side, so under 600 or 700 square feet, you may be able to forego the solar panel requirement. But these are the traditional backyard cottage, and they can be stick-built, as you can see here, or a modular unit. So on this topic of the different construction methodologies for ADUs, one of the next questions that you're going to confront is what type of construction method you're going to use for your ADU. And there are three primary choices. The first one is called site-built or stick-built construction. This is the more traditional type of construction where everything is assembled, built on site. This allows for the most customization. It allows for changes as the building process progresses. Next, you have panelized construction. This is a type of prefab construction where you have panels that are built in a factory but then assembled on site. So construction follows a traditional site-built pattern, but the panels are craned in or delivered to your property. So there is some time savings there. And lastly, you have modular construction. So modular units are the ones that are fully built off-site in a factory. They're inspected off-site and then they're delivered to your property, often via crane. The thing about modular units, and we hear a lot of interest in them, is that homeowners often think that they are cheaper and faster. And the thing that you really need to be aware of when you're looking at pricing for different modular companies is that while the units can look really inexpensive, there are a lot of added costs that come with modular. So first of all, there's sales tax to consider, but there's also transportation costs, there's foundation costs, and all of these things really add up and can be up to 20 to 40% of the overall project. So what we often see is that even though people embark on the ADU process thinking that their modular unit is going to be a lot less expensive, they tend to come in about the same price as traditional site-built construction. That doesn't mean the modular can't be a great choice for a lot of folks, and there are a lot of great options out there, but it's something that you really need to do your research on and make sure that you're going with a reputable firm that has good experience and significant number of years in the business. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Jen to talk about timeline.
Thank you. So we get this question all the time. How long is this process going to take? And there are some variations on a theme depending on what you're building, depending on site conditions, depending on the team that you amass to support you. But we created this kind of image to give you some general parameters. So this image breaks out the timeline based on the different phases of the project. So typically the first 3 months is determining what you want to build. And this is the planning phase. It's what do you want to build and whether or not it might be generally feasible on your property. What are the anticipated costs that you might need to be planning for and potentially securing financing for? What are some of the designs that are helping you get inspired? Really kind of getting a chance to sort of start digging in to help you get a little bit more centered on what you think your plan might be. You then enter the design phase. That's around 1 to 6 months, and there's a lot of variability there. Sometimes it's driven by the team that you've selected and how you fit into the queue of their work that's already existing. Sometimes it's driven by complications on the site that need to be really understood and worked out with conversations that are flowing back and forth between the jurisdiction to make sure that the design that you are working with your professional team on can actually meet the local requirements or the requirements that are unique to your site. Really trying to make sure that by the end of that period, you have a construction set of plans that can now not only be utilized to send to general contractors, but can be submitted for permitting. The permitting process is driven by a few things. Sometimes it's going to be driven based on the unique features of your project and how many different departments are therefore going to be required to review it. But in accordance with different state laws that are in your favor, jurisdictions are required to accept a full application and then consider it deemed complete within 15 days. And then they have 60 days to be able to determine if it's approved. Now, what's important to know about that? We love to see that these are certain criteria that we can hold our jurisdictions accountable for. But essentially, if the jurisdiction has received your permit, they've agreed that it's complete, or your application for permit, they have agreed that it's complete, they have the ability to submit what's called plan check comments. These are comments or questions that they're seeking further clarification on from you or your architect or designer. And that can kind of restart that clock. So we always want homeowners to be somewhat prepared that the timeline during the permitting process can take longer than anticipated. But ultimately, the more that we work with really good submittals, and the ability to respond quickly to any kind of plan check comments can really expedite this timeline for you. And then finally, construction. It's usually about 6 to 12 months. Once again, somewhat driven by the professional you're choosing to work with to build the ADU and where you are in their queue of work. But it's also driven by things like weather, things that are outside of your control. When we hit our rainy seasons, it's not a great time to start your project, and we always have to, be mindful about that. But once a contracting team gets started, they're going to want to keep working and getting through the project. It's all can start to happen really fast and sometimes faster than the first portion of everything that you've been through. But we do want to really ground homeowners that there's a lot of variability that can affect the construction timeline. And it's important to kind of plan for that when you're thinking about your overall goals in who you're trying to build for, why you're trying to build, and what the overall time frame may look like. Okay. Next, I want to take us through sort of the ADU process by different phases. There's 6 phases here, and Anna and I are going to go through some high-level details about each of these phases and what you can kind of expect. So to start with, it's about getting started. So what does getting started look like? It's really trying to figure out what you want to build and how it may support your goals. It's really the first place to start dreaming. Are you wanting to create space for family? Do you need to have flexible options for potentially aging in place? Are you seeking to create rental income? These kinds of thought processes that you go through start to shape how you're going to think about that ADU, where it's going to be located on your property, how it's going to be oriented, and how it's going to be used, because that's going to drive a lot of the conversation that you're eventually going to have with your designing team. You also are in a phase of being able to look at a lot of different inspirational ideas. There are lots of floor plans that are available to give you ideas on how you can start thinking about the space that you might have available at your property. There's lots of exciting design concepts that you can start looking at. And it's also an opportunity once you have an idea of what's inspiring you, what you believe you're ready to build for, starting to work on what you think the budget might need to look like to support your project and whether or not the return on investment, also known as ROI, is something that kind of meets your personal financial needs. So, I'd like to take a few minutes and just talk about the budgeting process. So, it's really important in our work that we try and give homeowners early on in the process some real groundwork on what it might look like to build an ADU that they're desiring. We really try and ground homeowners in the basic costs generally associated with square foot. It's probably the easiest way to kind of give you an estimate out of the gate. We find that a lot of homeowners have not a lot of awareness on what it might actually cost to do the type of project that they're doing. And these numbers that we're sharing with you, it's really important to know they're kind of broad estimates and they're based on the overall cost to build an ADU. So the total all-in costs. And what I mean by that is there's kind of three different areas where project costs come in. There are soft costs. These are costs that are associated with your architect and your designer doing designs, any engineering work that needs to take place, any kind of property assessments, as well as permitting. Those are all things that are not related to the actual construction of your ADU. So that's in this number, as well as infrastructure, if there's going to be any form of utility upgrades that need to accommodate your ADU project. And then finally, this overall cost is the cost to actually build it. So, based on a lot of our work throughout many jurisdictions across the Bay Area, we've been looking at what is the market conditions? What are we seeing these projects kind of come in at? And what we're seeing is a range between about $450 to $600 a square foot. Now, I state this with a lot of caveats. There are a lot of things that can influence the cost of your project, and we're going to talk about those as we move through the presentation tonight. There's a lot of things that may influence your particular project, both on your own personal aesthetic and what you're trying to achieve, as well as your property conditions. But in general, we wanted to share what that overall cost per square foot generally looks like so that you can make really good decisions up front if this is really the time or the and if you have the budget to be able to take on a project like this. One of the slides, you can see sort of different types of ADUs, typical total costs, and how that looks as a cost per square footage. So as Anna mentioned, we're going to be sharing this presentation with you so you can take a deeper look at that. But it's just one way that we've tried to break that out. Um, you might notice like conversions of unfinished space tend to be one of the more affordable ways by which to create ADUs, depending on what you are converting and the condition that's in existence. Garage conversions are also a very affordable strategy, but garages vary. Attached garages, many of which are much older housing stock, and oftentimes trying to renovate those existing detached garages can be more challenging than demoing it and using the existing space to build a new ADU. But we wanted to give you kind of an idea based on some common square footages that we see and the common types of ADUs that we see. So, as I mentioned, there are different factors that are going to influence the cost. So, some of the factors that are completely outside of your control are general site conditions. So, if your property is on a hillside, there's going to be influences to your budget to try and support what it looks like to build in California on a hillside and what that means. There are certain fire regulations that might need to be addressed based on where your property is located and if it's in like a high fire zone. If you're on septic, that's a whole nother universe of things that have to be considered that can be a real cost driver for your project. So if you're not connected to a public utility and instead you have a septic system, there are oftentimes upgrades or replacements of that system that have to be addressed in order for you to add more capacity or use on your property. And those can have a real big influence on your ADU project and your budget. Soil conditions, they vary all over the Bay Area, and those soil conditions have impact on how you go about building your foundation and what type of foundation you need to engineer for so that you can ensure that that built ADU can survive various conditions that affect California communities. And then if you have to do utility upgrades, which can be really common, we have a lot of older housing stock, and the utilities that have serviced that housing stock are either close to their end of life, or they need to be upgraded to support more capacity. There are also factors that are within your control. So you hear the word finishes. That's the things that you select to put in your home, like faucets and handles and cabinetry and flooring and tile. All of those finishing touches are in your control, and you can choose really high-end appliances and high-end finishes, or you can go standard and really try and create some budgetary savings there. The number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, the size, the layout, all of those are going to have some factors, but definitely around bathrooms because you're bringing in more plumbing, you're bringing in more fixtures, and those have some additional costs. And how that ADU lays out within your site and within connection to your existing home can all have some different factors that you can control. A great example of this is we work with a lot of homeowners where they want to do a detached ADU and they have a really long or large lot and they want to put it all the way at the very furthest rear corner to really create that nice separation and to still build in a lot of yard space. But what that can also create is additional costs because you're going to be trenching your existing water lines, sewer lines to the furthest location on your lot, and that can be more expensive. So there's a lot of factors that you can control and certainly many that you can't. Some of the typical fees that are associated with building an ADU is you've got your planning permit fees, you've got your building permit fees. Depending on where your property is located and what type of project you're building, there are different departments that have to review the plan. And so each department tends to have their own fee structure. Sometimes it's a flat fee for reviewing the plans, sometimes it's an hourly fee. There are development impact fees. So anytime you're building a new housing in California, you are subject to development impact fees. This is the overall infrastructure that supports added residential space. However, per state law, ADUs that are less than 750 square feet are exempt from these additional impact fees. So that's just something to be mindful of when you're thinking about your overall goals and your budget. There are utility fees, connection fees to different utilities. These are limited if you're doing a conversion. So, for example, if you're converting existing space within the home or a garage, the concept is that you're already connected to the utility system and the infrastructure is already in place, and therefore you're not subject to utility impact fees. But each local jurisdiction has different rules around non-conversion units that you want to be mindful for, and those can be some fees to connect to the existing utility infrastructure. School district fees. So school district fees can be assessed, but they're only assessed if you are building greater than 500 square feet. And then finally, if you happen to find that you live in a high fire zone, there can be fire safety fees so that the local jurisdictions, fire department can ensure that the building materials, the building strategy, the building setbacks can all support fire safety in your particular community. So those are some of the most common and typical fees that you see as part of the overall process that are not directly tied to just the brick and mortar construction. All right, so when you start thinking about fees, you start thinking about money and you start trying to think through what exactly does it look like to potentially pay for this unit. And this slide represents a number of financing options that are really commonly used by different homeowners that we've worked with. So, starting at the top, there is the most common or a very common strategy, which is refinancing the mortgage of the primary home, where you essentially take out a much larger loan that covers the cost of your construction and it gets refinanced under one mortgage where you're paying principal and interest and amortizing payments until the term of the loan is complete. Now, this is a great option for accessing equity in your property. However, it's not a great option if you happen to have a very low interest rate on your primary mortgage. You don't want to break that open by doing a cash out refinance because the interest rates are much higher than they may have been when you first obtained that mortgage. So that's a consideration. The other two really common tools that we see homeowners utilize are second loans. One's a home equity line of credit, often known as a HELOC, and the other is a home equity loan. And the difference between the two, the home equity line of credit acts a little bit differently than a home equity loan. So the home equity line of credit is you determine how much equity in your property you're able to access. That's determined between the lender and the loan and versus the value of what your home is. And that line of credit, you can draw down what you need when you need it. So let's say you decide to work with a lender and you want to get a home equity line of credit for $300,000. You have enough equity in your home that if you were to take on that additional debt, that you still meet the underwriting requirements of the lender. That then $300,000 sits and you can draw it down for different phases of the project where you have different costs hit. And the reason it's really a common tool in creating ADUs is it's an affordable way to think about the timing of your money when you're going to have to pay for certain things throughout that timeline of the project. And you're only paying interest on what you've drawn down at any given time. So you're not paying interest on the full 300,000, you're paying interest on what you've drawn down and put into use. Now, what's challenging about home equity lines of credit is you're paying interest only, and that interest rate can fluctuate based on interest rates in the market. Um, you usually have a 10-year period where it's an interest only payment based on what you've drawn down. And after that 10-year period, it converts into what's much more typical, like your mortgage loan, where you start to pay fixed interest and fixed principal payments every month for the rest of the term, whether that rest of the term is 10, 15, or 20 years. A home equity loan is different in that it is also a second loan, so you don't have to affect the primary mortgage, but it is a loan that amortizes like your mortgage. So you're paying fixed interest and principal for the term of that loan. So if it's a 20-year second mortgage, you are paying principal and interest until it's paid off. Okay. There's also the reverse mortgage, and this is a tool for a lot of aging homeowners who may have a lot of equity in their home, but they don't have the income they need to be able to access it. So even if you have a lot of equity in your home, you still have to have the income to be able to take on additional debt. And for older community members, you may be on a fixed income. And so there are reverse mortgage strategies that allow you to take a lump sum that might support a project like an ADU, or you can take monthly draws over a particular term through a reverse mortgage. And all I recommend is that if you're going to consider a reverse mortgage, is that you work with a reputable lender who offers HUD-approved reverse mortgages because they are designed to minimize the risk of what the old school reverse mortgages used to do, which was oftentimes really challenging. You could get underwater between what you have drawn down for your reverse mortgage and what your heirs of your property, whoever may inherit your property, becomes responsible and liable for. So they've gotten a lot better, they've gotten a lot smarter, and they've gotten a lot less risk averse, and they are a great tool for older community members. There's also a really nice mechanism to borrow from your own personal 401k. Now, not every 401k plan allows you to borrow from it, But for those who have the ability to borrow from their 401k, it's a wonderful gap measure to support costs of your ADU project. So you can usually borrow up to $50,000 depending on how much you have saved in your 401k. And the thing that makes the 401k borrowing really unique is you are paying yourself the interest that it's being charged to you for borrowing your own money. And so it's a really practical loan that if the plan offers it, it's penalty free up to this certain amount for you to be able to borrow against it. Usually they're for 5-year terms, and that money is pulled out of your paycheck to make the monthly payment towards that debt until it is paid off. So it's a really unique strategy with a very low interest rate where you're paying yourself interest and can be a nice tool to use if you've got a gap in your project. And then finally, there are construction and renovation loans that exist. And a construction and or a renovation loan essentially allows you to add a project cost like an ADU into your mortgage. And they all behave a little bit differently, but some of them are ADU specific and they allow you to set up a 12-month construction loan where you're paying interest only during that loan for drawing down the costs of your construction project and making those payments. And that at the end of that 12-month period, your ADU is complete. It then converts into a second loan on your project. So there are a number of options out there when you think about financing, and these are the most common tools that we're seeing homeowners apply and obtain in order to help their projects move forward. All right. Another question that we get often is, will I have a new property valuation assessment conducted if I build an ADU? And the answer is that your main house, the property value that now calculates your property tax liability, it's not reassessed when you build an ADU. But the increase of the added value of your ADU is, and it's only of the added value. And it is much more de minimis than the overall reevaluation of your property value. So if you bought your home in 2016 and you are now adding an ADU to it, we're not going to do a reassessment of the home value in 2026, but the cost of your ADU and the value of that ADU will be assessed. One great resource if you live in San Mateo County and you're joining this webinar is to visit the San Mateo County Assessor's Office to get individual advice and to also read some of the literature on how they look at ADUs and how they try and evaluate them. It's also helpful for if you don't live in San Mateo County to visit your assessor's office, look at their website, because a lot of different assessor's offices have been flooded with these kind of questions and have put out guidance so you know what to anticipate. Okay. Uh, Second phase in the process is really learning the rules. So you've gotten started, you've got an idea of what you want to build, you know what you're trying to accomplish, the goals that you're trying to achieve with your ADU, you've gotten inspired, you've started to work on a budget, you've started to maybe even assess what your financial options might look like. But really critical before you start to move forward is to understand what the rules are around your property. Gathering basic information about your property, like the assessor's parcel, what that number is, so you know how to identify your property in public record. Being able to know how large your lot is. How is it zoned currently? These are all good starting places. It's also really helpful to know if your home is located within a flood zone, a coastal zone, a high fire zone, as these conditions impact the process of how and what you can build on your property. And it's important to know as much as you can about your property so you know how to work with the jurisdiction on the types of rules that they're still allowed to apply to your particular project. Um, Learning the local rules can involve going to jurisdictional websites and looking up ADU ordinances. All local jurisdictions are required to have an ADU ordinance, which breaks down their requirements that cannot be more restrictive than the state laws, but it helps give you guidance. Also understanding how maybe some of the conditions of your property may be impacted based on the local jurisdiction's ability to have certain controlling conditions that are related to the environment of their jurisdiction. And with learning all the local rules, being able to then take that piece of information and trying to apply it to how it may affect your budget are all really critical phases of this particular phase. So, a couple of things or a few things we want to highlight are factors that can affect your project. So, we talked about some earlier, but let's once again go back to hillside conditions. Hillside conditions have a definite impact on what you can build. It's going to be conditioned on your soil. It's going to drive what kind of foundation needs to be engineered to support that build. And depending on the steepness of that slope, there's a lot of different engineering that may need to come into play to see if that unit you're trying to create within the hillside condition can be supported. There's geohazard zones. So these are areas where natural hazards can pose a threat to life, property, or infrastructure. So think about earthquake and seismic zones, or liquefaction zones, or landslides. If your home is located in any of these particular conditions, that's going to have an impact on your project. As I mentioned previously, soil conditions definitely drive the type of foundation that needs to be designed for your particular project. High fire zones may drive the materials that you use or the setbacks that are going to be applied to your project that can, under these conditions, be more restrictive than state law. Flood zones. Flood zones are going to drive how you build on your property. What's the height of the flood zone plane? How can you achieve the safety factor of being in a flood zone by building to certain standards that the jurisdiction is going to have for any new construction, whether it's ADUs or otherwise, when building within a flood zone? Water, sewer, or septic conditions are going to certainly affect your project. So there are a lot of jurisdictions throughout the Bay Area and beyond that have special water districts that are driven by water supply, water usage that can have an impact on the cost of your projects. If you're connected to public sewer, that's a helpful condition. If you are connected to septic, that's going to be an additive condition that can have an impact on your property. There can be utility upgrades, as we've mentioned before. You may have a property where you need to upgrade your electric panel in order to handle new capacity, as one example. You may have to upgrade your sewer lateral, which is the primary connection to all wastewater leaving the ADU and the main home. And many conditions have created this situation where all of the sewer laterals need to be upgraded in a particular community because they're of a particular age. If you're located near creeks or other waterways, there can be different setback conditions that affect where you can build your ADU. So it's important to understand if you're near a creek, usually within 100 feet of a creek or some body of water, there are going to be different conditions that you have to be able to design for. Egress space, that all depends on how you're accessing this property, your property, and therefore the ADU, and how you're leaving your property and therefore the ADU. Or if there are other forms of egress that are allowed on your property that are memorialized in public record. Um, Coastal zone. If you're in a coastal zone, there is an additional process that you need to go through in order to apply for a building permit for an ADU. And so, knowing that you're in a coastal zone, you'll want to reach out to your local jurisdiction to understand what the coastal zone requirements for approval are also going to look like. Easements, they come in a variety of shape and form. The most common type of easements that can affect your project are utility easements. So if you have power lines that transact to your property, there can be an easement of where you're allowed to build in association to those power lines for personal safety and property safety. There can be underground utility systems that create an easement at your property that prevent what you can build within that easement. And so they're really important to understand. And if you're not sure if you have a public utility easement, You can look at a preliminary title report on your property that you can get from any escrow company, usually for a cost of maybe roughly $250 to see if there are any recorded public utility easements on your property that you have to account for. And then, certainly local rules that are still allowed to be applied by different jurisdictions based on property conditions, zoning conditions, or other, can have an impact on your property. And then, as we were talking about, utility easements kind of tuck into some of the other easements that can affect your property. Okay. All right. So, one of the things that has been just phenomenal as we were talking about the popularity of ADUs and what's been happening across our state with ADUs is that the state came in strong in 2020 with a whole suite of laws that are designed to remove so many of the barriers that had been in existence across multitudes of local jurisdictions that really made building an ADU very difficult. And so now we have a set of laws that really protect you as the homeowner and create a very standardized, objective set of rules by which you can plan for your ADU project. So you've got ministerial approval, which means that a local agency must approve an ADU application if it meets the objective or the pre-established criteria set by the state law. There are no discretionary reviews that used to be in place. There's no subjective judgmental decisions that can be applied that are more restrictive than the state. And there is no public hearings required or allowed. So it's an important piece to allowing homeowners the freedom to create more housing on their properties. You also have state law protections in place for what's kind of called state exempt ADUs. That may be a term you start to hear as you start digging in and doing some research. And state ADUs state exempt ADUs are a class of ADUs that are allowed and fit certain objectable standards by the state. So JADUs are state exempt ADUs. ADUs that are less than 800 square feet, conversion ADUs, they all follow under a state exempt protection. Once you start to increase that ADU above 800 square feet, you start to lose some of those protections from the state. So these are things to just keep in mind when you're thinking about what you're trying to plan to do and what kind of process you're open to going through. Um, there are also lighter parking requirements that are now associated with state laws. So parking used to be kind of what we call a poison pill for creating any new housing. If you couldn't create a number of parking spaces that were going to be required when you build a new home on your existing property, it became a no-go decision. So the state came in and made a number of exemptions that don't require homeowners to create additional parking. Some of those examples are if you live within a half-mile walking distance from public transit, or if you're within 1 block of a ride share center, you are exempt from having to create additional parking. But if you do find that you are required to create parking, um, you are not required to create more than one space of parking per ADU or per bedroom, whichever is less. And that really creates flexibility. And the parking that needs to get created can be in tandem, can be in the garage. Excuse me, it can be outside of the garage in the driveway. There's a lot of configurations that don't require that you create an existing parking pad. There are certainly a lot of questions that homeowners have when it comes to parking regulations. And if you feel like you're in a unique environment that has a lot of parking protections, you should absolutely make sure that you understand what parking you are exempt from and what parking you are not exempt from the local jurisdiction. Um, there are limits via state law on the HOA's authority. So if you live in a community that has an HOA, there have been historically a lot of rules and regulations that prevent you from renting any portion of your property or what you're allowed to do to your property. HOAs no longer have the authority to prohibit you from building an ADU or utilizing your ADU as a rental. However, they can have certain design standards that create aesthetics that fit the community by which the the HOA governs, but they cannot be more restrictive than state law. So it's an important piece to know. And then hot off the press, any lot Single family resident lot can now build up to three state exempt ADUs in any configuration and one junior ADU. And that is massive. Now, you have to have a lot that fits the sizes of what you're trying to do. And there's still a lot more guidance that's going to be coming out from the state on how this new law in 2026 plays out. But we wanted to highlight it here because depending on where you're at in your process and what you're visualizing and dreaming up, we want you to know of what the current potential is so you can think about what the potential opportunity is on your property, should you consider starting with one strategy and then building on it over time. And then there are now laws that create easier pathways to legalizing unpermitted, informal, unwarranted ADUs that have been created, as long as they've been created prior to 2020. One thing that's important to know is that the protections that have been put into place are to prevent penalties, fines, and other recourse if you bring forward a desire to legalize your ADU that was built prior to 2020. It also, some of the laws around legalization have shifted the requirements, sometimes subjective, sometimes more, where you have to return that ADU to make sure it meets current building codes. Now that ADU just needs to meet very specific health and safety codes. And that really has opened up the opportunity for a lot of homeowners to bring these unwarranted, unpermitted spaces back into compliance so that they can freely utilize that ADU for all of its potential. The one caveat that I'd like to share is that jurisdictions are catching up to all of these law changes. And especially when it comes to legalization, many of them have yet to really adapt, train, or adjust their permitting response and their team's knowledge on how to implement this new law. So we want you to know that the law is on your side and that these protections are in place. But no matter what the circumstances are, you're going to want to work with your local jurisdiction. You're going to want to be informed that the law is in place, and you're going to need to have some patience while you work it out together in some jurisdictions that have yet to really create a true toolkit that allows the legalization process to feel a little bit smoother and certainly a lot more efficient to move through. All right. Utilities. Utilities are governed by a whole other set of regulations and rules. And as much as the state has truly chosen to kind of minimize some of the barriers that we've experienced in building, we still have utilities that we have to work with that are separate and not necessarily governed by the state laws. So they can require long lead times. Very specifically, PG&E, if you are doing a connection to PG&E, if you're adding a new meter of any kind, there is a pretty long lead time that's associated with working with PG&E on your project. In many circumstances, the ADU has been completely finished and we're still waiting for PG&E to come and connect it. So it's important to be mindful of this. PG&E will not typically accept an application until your permits are approved. So you want to make sure that when you're working on an ADU project and you have permit approval, that you're immediately applying for utility service and connection with your local utility jurisdiction and specifically PG&E. Utilities are driven by site-specific conditions. Some of those examples might be the trenching example that I was talking about earlier, where depending on where you place that ADU, if it's detached, how it's going to connect to the existing infrastructure is going to be site specific. And it's important to understand that when you're working with utilities. Some examples of potential added cost include having to have a separate water connection, potentially having to upgrade your electrical panel or adding a sub panel or even a separate meter. Some communities require any new construction to underground their power lines. And then, as I mentioned, sewer laterals is a really common piece of infrastructure and utility that has to be upgraded when you're building an ADU, mainly because it's reached its natural life, and the jurisdiction wants to make sure that if we're going to add more capacity, that more capacity can be added without creating more challenges to the infrastructure that it currently exists. Okay. All right. And then there is phase three, and this is design. And so you've gotten started, you've gotten inspired, you know what you want to build. You have been learning the rules, you understand aspects of feasibility, things that can drive different costs and experiences and requirements on your property. You are now at a place where you're getting ready to start hiring professionals to help you. And this is the design phase. This is your opportunities to start hiring design-related professionals to help you prepare the plan that will meet the local requirements and all of the construction building codes. Typically, the first phase of this process is working with your design team that you've hired to start creating kind of concepts, floor plan concepts, and a conceptual plan that helps you think about the layout of the space, the different rooms you want to have, how you want those rooms to be configured. And, that tends to move in each phase to more detail. So, and the second phase of kind of design is really getting more and more detailed about the features you want to see, experience in the home, how the home fits within the conditions of the primary home, what that conceptually looks like, what that relationship looks like. And once the basics are determined and more details start to flow, including the orientation of that property, windows, storage spaces, etc., you are then in a place, excuse me, to start moving into what's called construction plans. And these are the plans that are going to be submitted to the permitting department for the review. And there are also the plans that are going to be at your use to be able to start inviting general contractors to come and provide you with estimates of what it might cost them to build against that certain set of plans. It's also a time when you're thinking about hiring your professional team to consider totally different strategies. There could be pre-approved plans that are now abundantly available in many jurisdictions that really fit your site conditions, and you want to be able to explore those. Pre-approved plans are basically plans where the design of the structure itself, its interiors, all the way out to the exterior wall, have been reviewed by the local jurisdiction and they've been approved. However, they're not just approved by not having to add additional features. You still have to have a site-specific plan on how that particular plan may fit on your property. And there's other conditions like utility connections, all of which need to be further designed out. You lose that pre-approved plan status if you change anything about the current design, the current structure of the home. So it's important to know. But it's kind of like thinking about a almost baked cake that still has a lot of stuff on the back end that needs to be refined and organized by a design professional. But once that plan is finalized, then you are ready to move to stage four, which is the permitting process. When you're thinking about assembling your team, there are different ways you can go about it. Very traditionally is hiring an architect or a designer, where you meet with them and you start talking about your dreams, your concept, what you're trying to achieve, who the ADU is being designed for, what you want to experience in the space between things like natural light to different spaces that are going to be important for you in the way that you want to see it utilized. The designer, our architect that you hire, they tend to have different consultants that help them with the full build out of the plan. That includes a Title 24 energy consultant. So in California, we have an energy code. It's called Title 24. And all homes in California, new constructed homes, have to meet a certain calculation for energy efficiency. And so there's a consultant that helps do all of the mathematics based on the plan that you've come up with your architect or designer to evaluate that. You may be in a situation where you also have to have various engineers that support your project. Could be that you have to have a geotechnical engineer understanding your soil conditions. It might be based on what you're building, whether you're converting existing space or other, that you're going to have a structural engineer to think about the load of the home and how it's going to be supported by different requirements that they will have to engineer in. Or it can be civil engineering, depending on a variety of aspects of your lot. The other part of assembling your team is identifying who's going to build it. So you general contractor. So if you have a typical site built situation, you're going to have an architect designer. They're going to design it. You're going to take their construction set of plans, and you're going to go meet with general contractors. You're going to hand them the plans and ask them to create an estimate or what's called a bid of what it would cost them to build it. And so that's your general contractor. You can also choose to identify firms that are identified as design build. And this is, something we talked about earlier that Hello Housing's rolling out, but there are a lot of different design build firms where they design what they build. And it's all under one roof. So you're not working with multiple teams, you're working with one firm that is doing both things. And another part that might be important for you in assembling your team is hiring a project manager, somebody that can help you understand the different phases and can support you, whether it's a heavy support, light lift, or otherwise, through different phases that you know you could really benefit from some support on. So this is kind of the team that gets assembled when you're thinking about building an ADU. And with that, I'm going to pass it back on to Anna.
Thank you. So I'm going to do a quick time check. We're about 2 minutes past 7 o'clock. So I'm going to run through these next couple of slides. If you need to drop, know that this is going to be recorded. The good news is the next areas we were going to cover are areas that the ADU Resource Center has put out deep dive resources on. So I'm mainly going to direct you to those resources so you can learn more, but I will do a quick high level overview. So once you have your design in place, your team in place, you're going to get permits. Um, the permitting process is going to be you interfacing with your jurisdiction staff. Even though there is the state ADU law, every local jurisdiction is going to have their own individual ordinance, which Jennifer already talked about. A good place to start and a good place to start early is talking to the planning staff at your jurisdiction. You can always reach out to them before you have plans in place to get a sense of whether they see any potential issues that might come up. Jennifer talked about a lot of these potential issues or flags that are good to know about early. A hillside, a geohazard zone, a flood zone, creek setbacks, if you don't have an easy egress space for exiting, all of these things will affect your project, and it's good to be aware of them upfront. You'll need to bring in the folks who Jennifer was just talking about, the team. It can include a designer or architect, the Title 24 consultant, potentially a structural engineer, potentially a surveyor, and all of those folks will help you work with the permitting staff, the building, planning, and other staff at jurisdictions to get permitted. One thing to keep in mind is that there are a number of different departments within a jurisdiction. They're going to be part of the approval and permitting process. They may or may not work together well, depending on the jurisdiction. And always know that the utility provider, often PG&E, will need to get your ADU connected, and the local jurisdiction staff don't really have any authority over PG&E. And so it's good to start the utility process, the PG&E process, as soon as possible because that can add significant lead times to applications. Next, you have the construction process, and this is where you're going to start looking if you're doing a traditional process where you have an architect and designer, and then you're contracting the build out to a general contractor. You're going to start looking for general contractors. The ADU Resource Center did an entire webinar about finding GCs, vetting GCs, reviewing the bid process, and you can find that on our website. But a few quick points to note. First, when you're vetting general contractors, you want to make sure that they have a few things, that they have general liability insurance, that they're bonded, and many will have workers' comp insurance. You can verify their license and bonding information and insurance information on the California Contractors State License Board. The website for that is linked here. The other thing to keep in mind is it's always good to find vendors who have local ADU experience working in your jurisdiction because they're going to know some of the quirks and nuances of your local permitting staff and your local inspection staff. So that can be really helpful and save you headaches down the road. Always remember to ask for references and look out for red flags like vague bids, overly simple bids, contractors that require large upfront payments before construction even begins, pressure tactics, and you want to make sure that your contractor has good communication. You're going to be working with them a lot. They're part of a broader team that may include your designer and architect and the other folks that Jennifer mentioned. And if they're not good communicators, that's going to cause problems for getting your project moving forward in a timely way. When you're reviewing bids, you're going to want to get multiple bids as a starting point, and you're going to want to review those bids apples to apples. What that means is you're going to want to look at each bid and look at the allowances. So what are the pre-budgeted costs that are incorporated in the budget of the bid, and what's excluded, what's not incorporated in the budget. Then you can compare those bids apples to apples and understand what the pros and cons are. Uh, as with life, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And so one red flag is if you see one bid come in significantly lower than the other ones, there's probably something going on there that you should look into. And finally is the move-in and rent process. If you are building your ADU with a goal of renting it out, we applaud you. The Bay Area is in dire need of new housing units and new rental units. So that is a great use case for ADUs and of course can help you earn some passive income as well. However, as a landlord, you will have certain responsibilities and it's very important to be aware of what those responsibilities are before you embark on the process. You should be prepared to be the first line of contact when things go wrong, when repairs are needed. So having your go-to plumber, your electrician, your exterminator on call will be helpful. We have done a webinar specifically on renting your ADU and what you need to know with another nonprofit in the peninsula, HIP Housing. So you can find that again on our website, learn a lot more about the details of being a landlord. The last thing I'll say about renting is it's very important to be familiar with the federal, state, and local laws around rentals. There are differences across different jurisdictions. Some are more progressive, some are less progressive. So understanding what the responsibilities are in your specific locale is going to be very important. And we do go into greater detail on that in the webinar that we did about renting your ADU. Okay, well, with that, we've gone a few minutes over, but wanted to remind you of the ways to access and stay in touch with our respective organizations. Like I said, the ADU Resource Center of San Mateo County has a lot of information on our website. You can find that at smcadu.org, and we're across all of the social channels. And I'll pass it to Jennifer on Hello Housing. But I did want to let you know as a parting point that our organizations partner around a free feasibility consult service. It's available to most homeowners across San Mateo County in particular. If you are at the front end of the process and you're interested in thinking more about what's possible on your specific parcel, then you can reach out to us. You can find the information for signing up at the link here and speak one-on-one with an ADU expert about your particular project.
Wonderful. Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure that you had ways to reach out to Hello Housing should you have questions about our services, have questions about an ADU. We have a variety of different ways that you can connect with us, both through these feasibility assessments. We have an online helpline for homeowners who are working through ADU projects, and you can get information by visiting our website as well as emailing us, and our contact information is there. Just want to thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Sorry we're running a little bit late. I know that there were some questions that were put into the Q&A, and Anna and I will work on creating responses to those, and they will be provided as part of the materials that are emailed back out to you so that we can save you some time in your evening. But thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.